So we'll be having some great talks today, and it's great to be talking about them in a non-forest ecosystem itself. Obviously this is a pond, but we're surrounded by Mexico's beautiful xeric shrublands. And yeah, I'm just very excited to hear about this wonderful work everyone is doing. And yeah, so we'll get started with Leah Samberg. So for the presenters, we'll try and keep it to 10 minutes, but if you go a little over, it's fine, and we'll do questions after each talk and maybe some more questions at the end. So that, yeah, Leah Samberg, if you'd like to start us off.
So we can look at it. All right, thanks so much for being here. I know people are just kind of like drifting back from the photos, so no worries about that. Really excited for the session today, and thanks so much to everyone who is participating and organizing. We are really excited to spend, as Sam said, talk about non-forest natural ecosystems. So I'm going to kick us off by talking about agricultural commodities and non-forest ecosystem conversion with the question of like, where should we be taking a closer look? That's really the question that I am trying to get to in my slide here, in my talk here. So some really quick background about why we're asking this question. So I'm Leah Samberg. I'm a scientist with the Rainforest Alliance, and I help to coordinate something called the Accountability Framework Initiative. The Accountability Framework Initiative is a collective initiative of all of the organizations that you see here that's intended to support and scale up agricultural and forestry supply chains free of deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and human rights abuses. So increasingly, there's a need in many corners to quantify ecosystem conversion. At the beginning of the AFI's time, about a decade ago almost, that need was for no deforestation and no conversion commitments of companies, of traders, manufacturers, retailers. There was the New York Declaration on Forests, where companies were committing to have no deforestation and no conversion across their supply chains. Since then, there's been increasing needs to quantify ecosystem conversion, whether that's for land use change emissions accounting, for example, for SBTI flag targets, for nature target setting, for example, the SBTN land targets, or for regulatory compliance, such as hypothetically the EUDR, and all sorts of other impending possible regulations in other countries. In order to do this in any kind of meaningful way, companies, policymakers, investors, and civil society need to align on exactly what land use change gets counted. And this is where the AFI comes in. So we work across a number of spaces to align accountability on commodity-driven land use change. So what's a forest? What's a natural ecosystem? How do you know when you've cut it down? How do you measure it? How should you report on it? So we've worked with everything from responsible production organizations such as certification bodies, monitoring and traceability tools, industry and sector initiatives such as the Consumer Goods Forum, the Global Platform for Sustainable Natural Rubber, the Soft Commodities Forum, a number of reporting and assessment platforms where we've worked to align metrics such as CDP and GRI, emissions accounting tools such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and target setting initiatives such as SBTI and SBTN. So we've worked across these to try to standardize the asks that companies are getting related to land use change in their supply chains. So an example is definitions. Greenhouse Gas Protocol, SBTI, and SBTN all use the accountability framework definitions for deforestation and ecosystem conversion. So conversion, what we're talking about today, loss of a natural ecosystem as a result of its replacement with agriculture or another land use. Conversion got into the discussion around deforestation because we realized that there were other things besides forests that we should be talking about. And that is where we are coming to today. So why are we talking about non-forest ecosystem conversion? So no one needs telling at this point in the meeting, but land use change is a major impact driver. For companies in the land sector, eliminating land use change from their supply chains is essential for delivering on any climate or nature target. It's a huge driver of emissions, of nature loss, and of human rights impacts. And we know that non-forest ecosystems are a big piece of the puzzle. Non-forest, natural, and semi-natural ecosystems cover a lot of the land. All pathways, plausible pathways for achieving a 1.5 degree future require halting conversion of these ecosystems in quite the near term. In addition, we know that policies to combat deforestation push agricultural expansion into non-forest ecosystems. The Cerrado is sort of, as everyone knows, the real case in point here, whereas we've had policies to protect the Amazon, we've seen increasingly rapid encroachment into non-forest ecosystems in Brazil. So here's some data from Trace looking at, in red, non-forest conversion, and in blue, forest conversion in biomes in Brazil between 2015 and 2019 that are linked to soy. So you just see this huge focus on non-forest conversion. At this point, people have a good sense of that. Companies that are sourcing a lot of soy from Brazil are saying, okay, great, we're gonna try to figure out how to expand our no deforestation commitments to protect the Cerrado. Is there anywhere else we should be thinking about conversion? Is it just the Cerrado? Is it just Brazil? And nobody has an answer. Companies ask, and they say, you know, are there other commodities that are at risk for non-forest conversion? Where should we be looking? Nobody knows. So that's where we are at. Where should we be looking? Other than Brazil, other than the Cerrado, we don't have a great answer. We don't have a great answer because there's limited information out there about where non-forest ecosystem conversion is significant. Conservation science and advocacy has historically focused on forests. Globally, the data on non-forest natural ecosystems is inconsistent. Different data sets classify short or sparse vegetation in different ways. And in addition, most global data sets don't separate planted or intensively managed pastures from natural or semi-natural ecosystems. So the goal of this study is a very high-level one that I'm about to talk about. We wanted to identify just potential global hotspots of conversion of non-forest ecosystems to agricultural lands, and to identify crops that may be associated with that conversion. It's a very coarse analysis. Really, the goal is to start a conversation with companies about where there might be risk in their supply chains and where they should be looking more closely. This study was led by C.E. Khan at Samberg Biodiversity and Climate Research Center. She unfortunately was not able to be here. So if there are questions that I am unable to answer, my apologies about the technical details, but I'm sure I can put you in touch with somebody who knows the answers to them. So the methods for identifying conversion hotspots, we use data from the UN GLAD Lab on their global land cover and land use change. I think that I might have mixed up some of the L's and C's and U's in there, I apologize. And we looked at everything that was short vegetation or wetland in the year 2000. When we're trying to define what's a semi-natural or semi-natural land forest ecosystem that might be converted. Now, the UMD data set, like most, doesn't separate out natural land forest ecosystems from pastures or agricultural ecosystems. So we used Global Pasture Watch from WRI, which you will be hearing about shortly, so I will not go into detail, to separate out the cultivated grasslands from there. So we said anything that is short vegetation or wetland and not cultivated grassland in 2000, that's a natural or semi-natural ecosystem. And if that same land in 2010 or in 2020 was cropland or cultivated grassland, it's been converted. We then attributed that conversion. So if it was converted to cultivated pasture, we just considered it a direct attribution to livestock. We didn't distinguish which type of livestock. And if it was conversion to cropland, then we allocated that conversion based on national cropland expansion from the FAO and spatial distribution of those crops based on MapSpam from IFPRI, the new 2020 data layer that they've just put out. A couple limitations of this method. The definition of natural forest ecosystem might include fallows and other land that was cultivated before 2000. We're exploring those dynamics in region-specific analyses, and Anna will be talking about that later this afternoon, as will Tyler. There's a pixel counting approach, which can lead to some illogical land cover change in cases where 1 year might be misclassified, and there's work in progress to resolve some of those issues before this is published. I know I'm behind. I'm going to get there. All right, so now let's see what we found. These are the maps. The top one is where we found conversion of natural vegetation to cropland. The bottom is where we found conversion of natural vegetation to cultivated grasslands between 2000 and 2020. As you can see, the two things are more or less happening in the same places with some differences and across continents. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So this is the top 15 countries, just in terms of absolute area, that came out of this analysis. So in the front, we do see Brazil with about 12% of the total global non-forest conversion. In blue is the cultivated grassland, and in red is the conversion to cropland. So these are some of the countries that we are looking at more closely in our continued analyses. this is the map of attribution by crop, where again, we took the conversion that was just to cropland, we overlaid it with information about crop distribution and crop expansion, and this is what we see. We see about almost a quarter of that conversion is for maize, 14% for wheat, 12% for soybean, with other crops at less than 5% each. You can see some predictable patterns. You can see the soybean in South America. You can see maize and soy in the US. You see some rapeseed in green up in Canada. So a lot more to look at here. I'm going to speed through these, I promise. So this is that same figure of the 15 hotspot countries with the amount of conversion, with the attribution there. So in the gray in the bottom is conversion to cultivated grassland. And then again, you can see that blue in Brazil is soy. We see some pink in India for cotton. You see a lot of maize showing up in China and the US. The dots that you'll see on there are the overall percent of the non-forest natural ecosystem in the country that was converted in that time. Let's see what else do I want to do. We also broke this down by ecosystems within those countries, and I won't get too detailed into that, but this is what that looks like. So for example, in Brazil, we've broken it down by biome, and again, you can see the Cerrado rising to the top with cultivated pasture and soy, a little bit of maize, a little bit of sugarcane showing up there. And then in the US, we see the northern shortgrass prairie coming to the top, with soy, with maize, with some rapeseed, and then going from there. So these are some of the ways we're trying to get a little better handle on, again, where we should be looking more closely at non-forest conversion for commodity agriculture. All right, some next steps of this work is that we're going to finalize the study and hopefully get it out there in the world. We have ongoing regional scoping analyses and workshops to understand dynamics in key countries and ecosystems that you'll hear more about this afternoon. We're doing an analysis of biodiversity and carbon values associated with the at-risk ecosystems in those hotspots. And finally, we have a lot of ongoing discussions with companies to try to link this information to their supply chain needs and priorities. Thank you so much. Sorry for the rush at the end.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Leah. And also thanks for mentioning that this is one session of two. So this part will all be on the global impacts, definitions, and policies around non-forest ecosystems. Then after lunch, we'll be back in here to talk about regional work, looking at those same issues. So we have time for a couple questions. So does anyone have any questions for Leah?
Thank you for your presentation. So I saw on your graphs the list of crops that you are looking at, and also in terms of grassland conversion. I know for my master, I studied in the northern part of Ivory Coast, and I was looking at cash crop encroachments to the national park that was in the north, and the main cash crop was cashew. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you identify that, or if you are looking at that as well.
Yeah, great question, and I know I had to rush through these. They're grouped in that map as nuts and oils. So if you see, I don't know if I can go back to the map or not, but yeah, we're looking at nuts and oils. It shows up in nuts and oils, and it does show up pretty extensively in some places. And then we have the actual crop level data behind it, so we're able to then break that down by crop. So, for example, there's also a category here that's just other cereals. There's a lot of cereals that show up in Australia, and we look more closely, and it's barley, which was new information, so now we're looking into barley. So yeah, we're definitely able to also look under that sort of grouping at some of those more detailed crops.
Okay, Leah, very fantastic presentations. Maybe I'll follow this question, but I saw in your map, your legend, there's a big chunk of unattributed over there. What is this unattributed over there?
So about 10% of the conversion that C found in this analysis was unable to be attributed to crops based on the FAO and MapSpam data. I think there just wasn't any crop that showed up as expanding in that pixel. So it's just something that she might have to give you more detail on. But yeah, she said it was about 10%. It was more in some countries and less in others, but globally about 10% of the conversion didn't have a crop expansion associated with it.
Awesome. We have time for one more question. I know your hand was up for a while.
Thank you. Claudia from Holland Food Ingredients. Thanks a lot. I mean, I'm really waiting for these results. Hopefully it's very soon. I know you mentioned it, but what would you advise companies to use if we want to monitor now? We'll start as soon as possible with conversion, because you know, like in cocoa and coffee landscapes, this is overlapping just not with tropical forests, and for us this is urgent. And we have tried to do some of these exercises with available data sets there, and one challenge we face, and this is another question for you, is how do you manage to disentangle the difference of, say, if you use tree cover to distinguish between a savanna and a heavily degraded forest. You know, that's so tricky, because in the end, there's also a challenge we're facing with EUDR, because you use a certain tree cover percentage to monitor. You can punish farmers, right? Because you think your algorithm is telling you it's an ecosystem, but it is not.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, some of our goal with this work and with our conversations with companies in general is to sort of get away of a binary that's based on a canopy cover threshold, which really isn't not a good indicator of the health of the ecosystem. Like you said, it could be a really great savanna or it could be a really degraded forest, and it doesn't. The canopy cover isn't super helpful. So really trying to focus on what are the natural ecosystems that are existing in a large swath in places where they should be, and where are they shrinking, and not worry about things like the canopy cover. When you get into the question of ecosystem health, that's obviously, and degradation, that's obviously a much trickier one. And it's something that, for grasslands at least, the Global Pasture Watch work is trying to sort of tease out a little bit of what's a sort of natural-looking grassland or savanna, and what's looking to be more intensively managed or manipulated. So it's hard, but I'm happy to talk more later about some of the things we recommend to companies. Thank you so much. I'm turning it back to Sam now.
Okay, so I'll be presenting, I'm Sam Levy. I'm also with the Rainforest Alliance and the Accountability Framework Initiative, along with Leah. And I will be presenting on a framework to define non-forest natural ecosystems for policy and mapping applications. We've already covered this a little, but just for context, when we're talking about a non-forest natural ecosystem, we're basically saying a natural ecosystem is an ecosystem that resembles what we'd expect to find in the absence of major human impacts, so that can include a degraded ecosystem or a pristine one. And when it's non-forest, we mean less than the FAO forest definition, is kind of how our team works. So we're talking about grassy, open ecosystems, such as grasslands, wetlands, savannas, amongst others. These are globally important ecosystems. So we're talking 20 to 34% of global carbon stocks, 33% of global biodiversity hotspots within these non-forest natural ecosystems, and they provide critical ecosystem services. So for food, for soil health, and for water, these ecosystems are critical. And they're being rapidly converted. So since the start of this millennium, 11% of grasslands were lost in 13 years, which is a huge number. As Leah mentioned, a way to combat this is supply chain governance. So by getting the companies that source agricultural goods from these areas to change their behavior and their sourcing to no longer source from newly opened areas. And there's a lot of reasons why these companies should care about this. Their Scope 3 commitments, which include the emissions from non-forest natural ecosystems, regulatory compliance, such as Brazil's native vegetation protection law, often called the Forest Code, but it's actually much broader, as well as the no conversion commitments of many companies. So while all of this looks good on paper, it's really hard to actually, for companies to measure this, so they don't know, they can't really monitor this compliance, and therefore they don't know if they're effective, and that's a big challenge. And to do that, we need really good definitions and data sets for these ecosystems. And that's kind of where this project's coming in to try and improve definitions. So as Leah already showed, the accountability framework already has a definition for conversion, which is here, and you can look at the QR code. You don't need to read the whole thing, but just to note that basically what we mean is a kind of a binary change from a natural ecosystem to a primarily agricultural landscape. And this is like a binary change within a 10 to 20 year time frame. And the way we've been thinking about that is really around this change is a profound and sustained change in a natural ecosystem's species composition, structure, or function. And this is, scientifically sound, but when a company says, how do I implement that, we do need kind of clear recommendations on how to implement this definition, which is what we are trying to do. So, and the reason why this is difficult is because while we do have clear cases of these two binaries in the natural ecosystems box, it's pretty clear that there's these pristine natural savannas like untouched Sahara, which is clearly natural, and there's a soy field, which is clearly converted. But there's these tricky cases that kind of fall somewhere in between, like an improved pasture. So when you fertilize a native grassland and you seed grasses, is that still natural? And how about when you overgraze a grassland and there's too many livestock on it for many years and it's quite denuded? Is that still natural? And then how long after a cropland has been abandoned does it return to being natural? These are tricky questions that we don't have great answers for. And we've been thinking about these through the concepts of ecosystem function, structure, composition, and regenerational capacity, primarily. So this project this component of our project has a few objectives. The first is to understand and synthesize existing definitions and classifications related to non-forest natural ecosystems and conversion. Second, we want to determine a set of narrative definitions to differentiate these natural ecosystems from converted lands, and then generate guidance to give directly to companies to try and help them improve their behaviors, which we hope will protect these ecosystems from conversion to commodity agriculture. Our strategy, I'm focusing primarily on the first one of these here, and our strategy to do that is to review existing definitions and tools related to these ecosystems that we can find online, so the grey literature, peer-reviewed as well. And the way that our approach to break this down was to look at, try and identify parameters. So by which I mean the characteristic that these definitions use for what is natural and what is converted, and then to try and see if there are thresholds for these characteristics. So at what level of that characteristic does it flip from being natural to converted? We also assumed that there's different approaches, or different epistemologies in which scholars are using these characteristics in different ways to look at the same characteristics. And we also assumed that there would be different contexts, so the same parameters and thresholds might be used differently in different locations and different commodities. So what I mean by this, and sorry, this font has changed so it doesn't come out that clearly, but basically we assume that there'd be, approach one and approach two, that'd be looking at the same context and might combine the same parameters in different ways. Approach one here is kind of additive, approach two is more Boolean. So that's kind of what we thought going into it. So to go to the results here, we identified 73 efforts to identify natural ecosystems and differentiate them from converted lands. So we found 11 narrative definitions, by which I mean kind of primarily paragraphs of text saying this is natural, this is converted, such as our own definition at the AFI, the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology, and others. We found 12 global geospatial data sets, 19 regional geospatial data sets, and 31 thematic products, so focus on a specific characteristic of this question around natural and converted. Broadly, we found that definitions agree that removing natural vegetation and replacing it with non-native or cultivated land constitutes conversion, so not a big surprise. But when we tried to understand more about these tricky cases, we weren't really finding information that cleared this up. Degradation, intense use, and regeneration, these continuous processes, remain tricky. We also found some key parameters and thresholds, so we found 50 of these, and we grouped them by activity, condition, and history. So I'll give you just 2 examples for each case. So for activity, my examples here are plowing, so turning up the soil, and seeding and sowing, so adding seeds, adding new species to that landscape. For condition, there's landscape fragmentation, so how is that connectivity changing? And for vegetation type, it's really the difference between expected vegetation and observed vegetation. And for history, the variables here are time since disturbance, so how long ago was there a change in that ecosystem, and what was the land cover beforehand? Because maybe if this land was under concrete or if it was under a soy field, it would take longer to recover. And what you might also notice is that the threshold column isn't that nice. It's really just the units here. Like there's no clear thresholds coming through. in this review. So there's a real lack of evidence or consensus regarding thresholds, which was a bit of a surprise to us. And the reason for this is kind of comes down partially to the approaches used. So we identified 3 key approaches. The first is we're calling exclusion, so where you identify everything that's forest and everything that's anthropogenic, and kind of the remainder is your kind of short vegetation that hopefully is natural, which is what the GLAD Labs global data set does. And you can also try and say what's anthropogenic and short as well. And this is simple and good and easily understandable by companies, but it's not good at distinguishing these tricky cases I've been talking about. There's also a probabilistic approach where you generate a probability of converted versus natural land by training machine learning data and parameters, which is what Global Pasture Watch does, which we'll be talking about shortly. And this is very good at the tricky cases, but probabilities are hard to interpret for narrative definitions. Like a company doesn't want to commit to a certain probability. But this isn't really how the Global Pasture Watch is intended to be used. It's more of a tool for implementing a different definition. And then the third one is we're calling multi-parameter. So where you combine multiple parameters with Boolean terms, with and without thresholds, which is what the FAO LCCS does. And this can deal with the tricky cases. It's highly flexible, but it's highly complex. So you need expertise to determine natural and converted, which again is not useful really for a a purchaser at a company in a local country. So exclusion seems to be the easiest case, but it has this issue with the tricky cases. So let me very quickly go into the tricky cases a little bit more. Because the issue really here is that these are continuous processes. So continuous degradation, intensification, and regeneration is going from this pristine ecosystem at the end to something converted. And it's not a step change. It's a continuous journey from this green zone to the pink zone, and it's hard to find a hard line. So we know that theoretically this is a big problem. But we can also think, actually, is this a real issue in international supply chains? So we've been talking around the world to experts, stakeholders, and academics and reviewing the literature, and this has been really helpful. So for example, in the case of degradation, so in the case of, livestock on grassland, overgrazing, does that actually degrade it to the point where it's no longer functioning like a natural ecosystem? And we actually found very little evidence for this. So maybe for this particular tricky issue, for the international supply chain case, is not as relevant as we had feared, which would make our job easier in terms of our recommendations. So in terms of next steps and remaining challenges here, we're going to be continuing to synthesize data and looking at these tricky cases, and it's an open question whether simple thresholds are actually possible for differentiating non-forest natural ecosystems from converted lands in the supply chain context, if these tricky issues turn out to be as serious as we had perhaps feared. But if they turn out not to be, then perhaps we actually can do simpler definitions and everything will be nice and easy for us. So we'll be keeping to look into those. And if you have any, sorry. So, and this is really where we conclude that these ecosystems are important, they're hard to define, they're really varied, and we're still trying to figure this out, and we're very open for input. So if you have expertise on how to define natural and converted non-forest natural ecosystems, or non-forest ecosystems, I guess, we would love to hear what you think, and so talk to me afterwards, make some comments now, and tell me why I'm wrong or why it's all actually already fixed. So with that, thank you to my co-authors and to your attention, and the many stakeholders who've already given us their time, as well as our funders. Could you do the microphone?
Here, and then you can pass it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have maybe 2 comments or as a reflection. When you talked about the continuum, I was thinking first about the EU policy on set-aside lands, because how are you going to deal with this? This is a dynamic continuum, and it's a regulatory approach to set aside something which becomes fallow, and then after 5 or 10 years, the farmer decides to reconvert. It's correct from a regulatory point of view. How does it fit into this framework? And the second thing is seasonality effects. How do you deal with agriculture areas which are just sometimes in some years used, then they're maybe flooded naturally, pantanals or whatsoever. So how does it fit into this kind of framework and thinking? So, because actually for me it makes sense that there's a continuum and there not needs to be a threshold ecologically thinking.
Yeah, this is definitely, it is a continuum, and we're just trying to like grossly simplify it for the use case of international supply chain companies, which are working in the, is it a natural ecosystem or is it converted? But the issue you raise around like long fallows, the same issue that you mentioned in the EU is also an issue in the US, one of the hotspots Leah mentioned, where there's CRP lands, which are these like conservation areas that are set aside and held for a period and then can be used again. And definitely, if it's still within an agricultural system, like if it genuinely is a long fallow, then it's still agriculture. The land use remains agriculture in a fallow. But there is a certain point at which it becomes really restored.
Well, maybe one solution for the agriculture is the tenure, because if the tenure is defined as agriculture land, the farmer has the opportunity to set aside or not. So if you have tenure information, of course, like in Vietnam, for example, it defines agriculture or forest land. It's up to the farmer what to do, and this is a kind of, for you, kind of plug-in information, but this is natural information usually, of course.
Yeah, that would definitely help, but it's just hard to get hold of. Joss?
Thanks so much for this great work. I think it's really important and needed, so congratulations for doing this. My question is to both you and Leah, kind of around the politics and your experiences of engaging with companies, which you talked about at the end, and how much interest there actually is in this. So obviously you've mentioned how this is important in the Accountability Framework Initiative, it's being incorporated in the SBTN and so on. But actually, in sort of my research, one of the drivers for companies to adopt particular standards are NGO campaigns, civil society action, and that's been really focused on forests. And even in, I know of a case in Gabon where Mighty Earth were actually telling Olam that they wanted them to plant in the savannas because it was non-forest, even though that was actually a rarer ecosystem in that situation. So I'd just be really interested to hear from you both about what's your experience of engaging with companies about this, how much interest is there, how much is this like an uphill battle to try and get this adopted?
Yeah, I think Leah can probably speak better to the uphill battle side, but just to note that one of the aspects of this project is to demonstrate better the evidence for why these ecosystems value to try and help those campaigns.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, so I mean, a couple of, I think, responses to there, and one is that land use change emissions are a big piece of this. If companies are setting flag targets, they need to have a number for their land use change emissions, whether they want to or not, and because SBTI and GHG protocol are using AFI definitions for conversion to define what carries land use change emissions, we just need an answer to say like, okay, what's happening out here is land management emissions, and what is happening out here that is land use change emissions, and what products are they associated with. So even regardless from actual commitments related to non-forest ecosystems, there's the need for some number. So that's, I think, the biggest current driver where companies are just saying we need data to plug into this, to this model. Other companies, I think, really do have concerns about regulatory risk, which we've been surprised about. Like, for example, in the U.S., we've had soy companies, soy producer associations come to us and say, we heard that there's going to be regulations in other countries that might reduce our ability to export soy. From, we don't know which ecosystems, we don't know from where, so can you help us find out where the risk is? So I think a lot of it is a risk perspective too, where even if they're not planning on setting a commitment right now, they want to know what might be coming down the road for them. So those are kind of like, aside from kind of the really big leaders who are setting, SBTN targets or are, just leading the way in the Consumer Goods Forum, which there are a few. Other than that, I think those are the two main use cases we're getting. Any other questions on the definitions for Sam? Oh, sorry, I should probably move on. Yeah, let's get one from Deepak while we switch it over. Sorry.
Teamwork. That was good teamwork, passing the microphone. So my question, Sam, is you told us about the definitions and the struggle with actually figuring out the thresholds. So I'm wondering, like, how much of the definitional part actually has been translated to the final map making which is taking place. For example, like one of the things of one of the identifying factors you talked about, if there is plowing or tilling of a natural landscape and then there is a planting, then that is a conversion. How much of that actually went on to the mapping part which Leah presented?
So the answer to that really comes through in the next presentations. So we will really get into that. But I think your point also is like a broader one. Like, even if we created the best definition possible and it was not implementable through mapping products, then we would kind of have this product that wasn't actually usable by companies. So we are trying to always move hand in hand with something that is really scientifically valid but also implementable. And yeah, and then we'll get into the mapping.
Yeah, I'll just add that the presentation that Leah gave was kind of like our first rough calculation of conversion, so we weren't able to fully apply the definitions to the data, but the last presentation, which I'm giving in this session, will get more to that. Oh, great. I'm Elise Mazer. I'm a GIS research associate at the World Resources Institute. I'm not Lindsay Sloat, who was supposed to be giving this presentation. Unfortunately, she got sick and wasn't able to make it this week. So forgive me, I have to look at some notes. But we'll be talking about global grassland mapping and monitoring at like a medium to high resolution scale, developed by the Global Pasture Watch Consortium. So just as some context, myself and Anna and Michelle, who are in the room, are all, and Lindsay, who's not in the room, are all research associates with Land and Carbon Lab, which is a team within the World Resources Institute, where we produce global geospatial data sets that we try to connect with what we call impact pathways, which are like the ones you can see here, like understanding the global land squeeze, protecting natural ecosystems, restoring degraded landscapes, reducing land sector greenhouse gas emissions, and improving agricultural and food system sustainability. And so we address a lot of these through the supply chain efforts that you're hearing today. And Land and Carbon Lab was created like 3 or 4 years ago. It grew out of Global Forest Watch. I assume many of you know what Global Forest Watch is, but it's a global monitoring initiative for mapping and monitoring forest cover and forest change. And we wanted to address all land covers since, as Leah and Sam both said, yeah, we care about other ecosystems as well. So there was a big gap in the ecosystems that were being mapped as we were building Land and Carbon Lab, and one of them was global grasslands and livestock at a global scale and consistently, but also at a medium to high resolution scale. So you'll hear about some other grassland mapping at the global scale as well today. So Lindsay Sloat brought together this consortium to advance this, or to fill this gap, and we called it Global Pasture Watch Consortium. And it's made up of experts in geospatial data, machine learning, ecology, and agriculture. So the first phase of this work is to produce global maps in a time series from 2000 onwards, and we're focusing on grassland extent and management, grassland condition and productivity, and then livestock density and the related methane emissions. So currently we're working on 4 different products. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail into the first one, but generally they're all 2000 through 2022, and we will continue to operationalize them, so we'll continue to produce them in ongoing years. The first one is this grass class map. It's an annual product at 30 meters, and there's 2 separate classes. There's there's cultivated grasslands, and then there's natural and semi-natural grasslands. The second map, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but the second map is livestock density, which is annual at 1 kilometer. This is the number of animals per hectare. It's separated out by species, by animal, and it relies on downscaled census and survey data. The third is the short vegetation height maps. These are they're also 30-meter annual products, and this relies on ISAT-2 LiDAR data. And finally, the last product of this phase is the gross primary productivity map, which is bi-monthly at 30 meter. And this uses a light use efficiency model. Yeah, we'll talk about these all. These are all in the works, and we're starting to get final products, and the grass class maps will hopefully be published quite soon. Of course, these are our first drafts. They're putting a ton of effort into making them, but they're not going to be perfect, especially at without a lot of input from stakeholders. So one of the big parts of this initiative is to gather feedback, which is why we have this little infinity loop. We're creating collections of data. So while we have 20 years of data, we're going to collect feedback, incorporate that into the map, and then rerun the entire history as we go and collect more feedback. They use GeoWiki, which is a platform made by the EASA group to collect feedback. You can literally draw polygons or drop points of where you see things that are incorrect in the map. If you're interested in early access to the beta testing data, please come talk to me. We're really happy to share. You can also just register at GeoWiki or geo-wiki.org. The different pieces that I mentioned before are really building blocks. The goal is that we can combine them into better land use maps that fit your purpose. So if you want to know, for example, if you want to integrate a legend that considers not just whether grasslands are cultivated or natural or semi-natural, but also what their density of livestock is, and also how tall the vegetation is to kind of create this more complete picture of what's going on in that landscape, you can combine them, and they're being built to do that. Okay, so to get into details for this first grass class map, we start with Landsat Collection 2 analysis-ready data that was created by the GLAD Lab at Maryland. And then the team further processes it down, puts it through a machine learning model, trained by a large collection of training data, which I'll talk about in a second. And then we end up with these two different probability maps, a probability map of cultivated grasslands, and then a probability map of natural and semi-natural grasslands. Okay. So this is the training data set. There is a team of, I think, 16 folks who are working on this for several months to collect over 2.3 million tiles of training data. I think they're 1 kilometer tiles. And let's see, what else did I say? You can see the training data here. This goes into a random forest model. They tested out a few different types of models and landed on random forest. Quick note about the training data. They created a plugin in QGIS to do the training data collection. It's called the Fast Grid Inspection Tool, and this is open source. So if you are collecting your training data, you can just look this up in the QGIS plugins and are free to use it. Okay, so I've mentioned that we've done cultivated grasslands and natural and semi-natural grasslands, and so we need definitions of what those actually mean. So as the training group was going through visual inspection, they started to kind of narrow down what they're looking for in the imagery. So for cultivated grasslands on the left, they were looking for signs of enclosures like fencing or other infrastructure where there would be a high density of livestock. They're looking for actually seeing animals or signs of like cattle tracks. They're also looking for unusually homogeneous or unnaturally uniform landscapes. And then also cropland or crop rotation with livestock. For the natural and semi-natural grassland data, when they were looking at imagery, they were looking for an absence of infrastructure, so no delimitations between fields or between pasture lands, no signs of livestock or few signs, and a very heterogeneous landscape as well as natural seasonal patterns. Okay, I'm not going to go into the confusion matrix, but essentially we balanced out users and producers' errors to find different thresholds in the data to create a combined natural and cultivated map. And here you can see a preview of the data with the lighter orange being cultivated and the darker orange being natural and semi-natural. These data will be available on Earth Engine as well as in COGS and Stack Catalog, and eventually these will go onto WI platforms. We have some examples here of expanding cultivated grasslands. Again, the cultivated is this yellow color. This is in Paraguay. And this is in Uruguay. You can see the pasturelands, or the cultivated grasslands expanding. These both used like a smoothing filter over the time series to ensure that we're not catching just like single unique changes. Okay, I'm gonna skip through some of this, but basically, the early adopters who have signed up to work with this data have shown that there are a lot of applications of it. It can be used in land use planning and management, conversion-free compliance, as we're talking about in this session today, carbon accounting, and restoration planning. And you can use this QR code to go to an application to view it. And I think that's it. Happy to try and answer questions. Also, Sam and Anna are here to help as well. Yeah.
Awesome. So do we have any questions? Yep.
Thank you very much. I understood that you use GeoWiki for a form of validation or verification. What about national available maps? In Germany, we have a grassland mowing density map, which is basically explicit polygon level, field parcel level, and they have it for several years, I think 2019 to 2022. It's open access. So how about plugging in these stuff and then just comparing it? Have you thought about that as well? Or are you doing that in your approach?
Yeah, I believe that there were some other data sets used as comparison, but I would definitely love to write down the data set you're talking about to make sure that the group has it. Yeah. Oh, Anna, did you?
Yeah, just to clarify that the GeoWiki wasn't used for validation, it's just being used for feedback. And that feedback is going to be filtered. So that we're not taking just anyone's opinions. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, just one more question. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I noticed that you use a GeoWiki to collect the data. If this data is also available, so you collect the data from us, but can we also use data for our purposes to do independent validation? Thank you.
Yeah, my understanding is that all the data that anyone submits to GeoWiki highlighting any feedback is publicly available for anyone using GeoWiki to download, and so you could use it for yourself.
Awesome. We have time for a couple more questions. Okay. So I think we're going to finish on time, but I saw like pre-boxed lunches, so no one needs to run away. You'll all get food, and we can all leave at around 12:05.
Hi, thanks for this great talk. Found it very fascinating. I had one question about the training step and whether or not livestock were being considered in natural grasslands in places where there are frequent livestock use in systems like savannas. So if you're training data to not including livestock in those systems, doesn't that classify natural savannas as planted pastures? Then I was just wondering if that could be creating a bias in this.
Yeah, I believe that it wasn't no livestock, but it was like few livestock. But I think they were, I mean, I'm not sure if you have thoughts as well, but my understanding is that they were looking more for the, like, if it seems like it's high density or high, like, like highly degraded from the livestock. I don't know if you have any other thoughts, but.
So the people in the consortium are in agreement that some livestock is like a normal part or a natural part of the landscape. But yeah, I think that the main focus was on the structural differences and on the contextual differences between the ecosystems, but there's probably areas where the people collecting the training and the validation data didn't have a full understanding of what these systems are like, and that's why we welcome the feedback from the community.
Okay, so I think we're going to move on to our next presentation. So if we can get that set up.
Cool. Okay. So again, I'm Elise. I'm going to talk about the natural lands map, specifically beyond forests. This is a map that maps a baseline of where natural forests, grasslands, savannas, wetlands, et cetera, were in 2020. But since this is a non-forest session, we'll stick to the non-forest section. Okay, so quickly I'll just cover why are we going to map natural lands, which we've already talked about, what is natural and how did we do it. Okay, so as we've talked about, we're losing natural grasslands, savannas, and wetlands at unprecedented levels. A lot of this is due to agriculture, but we need to start expanding out of forests and understanding where this is happening and be able to have a baseline. So we work with the Science Based Targets Network, who are present in this audience, which is a voluntary corporate guidance for targets for nature. And with the Science Based Targets Networks, there are targets for freshwater as well as for land. And I'm just going to talk about one of the land targets today, but you can see all three here. The first being no conversion of natural ecosystems, which I'll get into. The second being a land footprint reduction target for agricultural companies. And the third being a landscape engagement target to ensure that companies are working in the landscapes that they're sourcing products from to ensure there's restoration and protection projects going on relevant to their sourcing products. So for target 1, the goal is for companies to set this target to have zero deforestation or conversion of natural ecosystems in their supply chains since 2020. Now, this brings up a few challenges, a few data challenges to be specific. There are two challenges that I'll talk about briefly today, which is that companies need to know what land was natural in 2020, so they know where something may be converted or may have been converted, and where they've sourced their products. I'm just going to focus on number 1. So our solution to understanding where it was natural was to create this map. This is a little preview. To make a data product that helps companies set that baseline for measuring conversion from. So again, it's a 2020 baseline, so you need change data to see what's changed, and then you can compare against it to see what was natural in 2020. Okay. Sam's already covered this, but we use the Accountability Framework Initiative definitions of natural ecosystems to start, and then we kind of do what we can with what available data there are, and are working on getting closer and closer to the definition as more data become available. So again, natural can include pristine natural ecosystems, as well as regenerated, managed, and partially degraded lands. I will say, the non-forest parts are where there are not forests, which is obvious, but yeah, still a little bit vague. Okay, now to the interesting part, or my favorite part. How did we do this? So this is our non-forest workflow. It's a little bit chaotic, but the map starts with 2 major data sets, ESA world cover and the GLAD land cover and land use change data set. And we get grassland data from ESA world cover. So we started with their grassland, shrubland, and herbaceous wetland classes. And then we go through this decision tree saying, we're going to assume it's natural unless we have data to prove otherwise. So we use the GLAD land cover data for field crops, for built up, and for tree cover. And if it falls into one of those classes, it either goes to non-natural land use, or trees are all have their own workflow. Then we use the Korean land cover data set from Europe, and we say they actually have natural grassland classes. So we say if they call it natural, it's definitely natural. So send that right to the natural class. If it doesn't overlap with either of those, we also overlap it with tree crop and plantation data set, the spatial database of planted trees, and a coconut plantation data set. Again, those get sent to non-natural if there is overlap. And then we get to the most important part and also the trickiest part, which is how do we actually separate out grasslands that are not natural? Until Global Pasture Watch is published, which I forgot to mention, or maybe I did mention, the first map will be soon. We're kind of stuck in this position of we needed to find a data set that matched most closely to the definitions of natural according to AFI, which was really tricky. And so we ended up using this proxy of livestock density. And as Sam just mentioned, it's like it's becoming quite clear that livestock density is not the right metric. So we set a really high threshold to say if there's a lot of livestock, we're definitely going to call it not natural. And we use the gridded livestock of the world data for that. And also set a minimum mapping unit, since that data are 10 kilometers and the rest of the map is 30 meters. And then finally, if the vegetation doesn't meet that high threshold, and it does have some vegetation on it, then it gets called natural short vegetation. And if it has a really low fraction of veg, it gets called natural bare land. This is just half of the picture because it's the non-forest part. But hopefully, when the Global Pasture Watch data gets published soon, we'll switch out this livestock section for cultivated grasslands from the Global Pasture Watch data, but soon. Okay, this is our full, or almost full, workflow. I just talked about this green area about grasslands here. And then we also have the second half of it where we apply a wetland like overlap to, say, wetland versus dry, or like terra firma short vegetation. And we also incorporate regional data. So since this is a global map that's intended to be used at a local scale, we really wanted to bring in as much local data as possible, because we know that there's more local knowledge included, as well as usually more locally relevant land cover classes. So that gets layered in, as well as a peat layer. Okay, as I was just mentioning, regional data brings local knowledge. You can see here in the map where it's dark gray, we use an entire land cover class map that we reclassify into natural and non-natural according to their class definitions. And then it's kind of hard to see, but there are some countries that are covered with like a hash mark, and those are where we include a regional, we include a single class or a few classes from a regional data set. So in gray, we have map biomass, all of their countries. I didn't list them all here, but we also use South Africa and New Zealand land cover data. And then some of the additional grassland classes are from Karine, from the US National Land Cover Database, and cropland data from Digital Earth Africa. Most importantly, we worked with EASA to do a validation and accuracy assessment. Since the world was roughly split 50-50, natural and non-natural, they did a complete random sample with over 4,000 points. And you can see our overall accuracy here of 91.2%. They're also now working on a validation of the natural forest class, which I didn't talk about here, but folks are interested in using it for things like the EUDR. So we wanted to specifically focus on that. And here's the actual map. We released version 1 just a few months ago in September, which was an update to the beta version that we had released in 2023. You can see we have a binary version because that's what companies are interested in. They want simple answers. But we also have all of the land cover classes split out on the bottom. I'm a little embarrassed to say I don't have a legend here, but it's because you should go to our interactive map and actually view it in more detail. But generally, gray is the non-natural classes, and then all the natural land cover classes are in fun colors. Some of the updates, really quickly, from the beta version are that we added a bunch of new data sets, both global and regional data sets, as well as updated some old ones that were included. We split savannas into forests and short vegetation, so we could get more close to an actual forest, a natural forest map. Yeah, in the near future, we will have that other validation and incorporation of Global Pasture Watch data. I will say, if you know of a data set that you think we should be looking at or including in here, I'm always happy to hear to assess whether it fits. And to Deepak's question earlier, this is our attempt at getting closer to the definitions of natural lands. Yeah, the next step is to actually figure out how to make conversion data from this, to Claudio's question. Yeah, that's a tricky one, but we're working on it. This is the QR code QR code for our app visualizer, so you can see the natural lands map There are also links to our technical note, to our GitHub, and a contact form if you're interested in contacting us. But yeah, also feel free to come talk to myself or Michelle or email us. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that great presentation. Just to note, like with this screen, QR codes can be a little tricky. So if it didn't work, just talk to us and we will give you the information. And what was that first question? Yeah.
Thanks, Elisa. And sorry for the many questions. We're already using this great map for decision making, but still I have some questions. First one, are you planning to release an update on a yearly basis so that we can monitor change?
No, not for the natural lands baseline. For the baseline, it's going to continue to be 2020. I think we'll definitely make at least one more update to the map, but then we're shifting our focus to working on a separate product that would actually monitor change.
Okay, looking forward for it. And the second one, for EUDR purposes, I mean, you say yourself that some companies are using it for it. What is your vision on the differences for EUDR purposes between this map and the year-C map?
Yeah, I'll start, but I might pass it to Michelle to continue. So basically, there's a few different differences in definitions. We have similar definitions of what a forest is, and then it gets a little tricky when you start talking about plantations and tree crops. So there are changes here, or I think that any changes you monitor from the natural forest class would be considered conversion according to the UDR, but there are additional ones that this wouldn't capture because we've already labeled it non-natural. And I don't know if there's anything big to add, but I also want to say that this is the non-forest session, so we should talk about non-forest areas. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, so the main thing is EUDR considers conversion of tree plantations, timber plantations, to agriculture as deforestation. But in our map, timber plantations are considered non-natural. So if you suspect that you're working in an area where there may be conversion from timber to agricultural areas, you may need to use an additional data set to capture those.
Yeah, and lastly, I'll just add that we always support comparing and adding up data sets to get multiple points of data before you make final decisions.
I will present in the afternoon a comparison with our own data set in case you're interested.
Great.
Hi, I'm Dominic Roto. I'm managing the North American Land Change Monitoring System. So you were asking about other data sets. We have the North American data sets that includes the US and LCD, and also Canadian and Mexican and land cover database. So if you want to use them, then just ask me. And it's already harmonized with the NLCD and the 19 categories of the FAO land cover change.
Great. I'll come ask you for that later. Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, and we will be finishing on time, so no one needs to run anywhere.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate your work because it sets like a global benchmark of these kind of information. So if you ask about these type of maps, have you been in exchange with FAO? Because FAO is supporting countries on national forest monitoring services, and the result will be geoportals, which are sometimes, in case of Ecuador where we worked, is an open geoportal with all kind of forest, non-forest information according to the Ecuadorian definition of forest, which is 30% tree cover, for example. So it's again interesting, and about maps, and for EUDR it's even more complicated now. Because if I'm a company and I source cocoa from Ecuador, so I can use your map, I can use the national map, and then I have funny, let's say, information. And then maybe as a company, I may go for yours, because maybe it's better for me, putting my due diligence statement to the EU. So my question is, do you provide any kind of uncertainty reflections on your maps, which these actors or users can keep in mind when they use your maps?
Yeah, good question. We haven't worked with FAO to incorporate this data or to get any of that data into the map, but yeah, something we should explore. We don't have any uncertainty scores on the map, but we do have a very extensive list of limitations and a very long technical note to explain the details. I also understand that not everyone reads 50-page documents. So yeah, I think that's an inherent limitation that we picked a single definition, or I shouldn't say that. We picked a global definition as well as local definitions from local data sets that we incorporated. But yeah, it's not going to matter. People have different definitions. So I think that's going to be an internal issue. Yeah. Cool.
So hello. Yeah. Now it's the right presentation. Hello from my side. My name is Karina Winkler. I'm a postdoc in KIT based in Germany. And now we're going to have a little bit closer look into the past. So we look at 60 years of global agriculture expansion into non-forest ecosystems, but we also look at other land use changes and especially the role of non-forest ecosystems conversion here. Mm-hmm. So we have heard that agriculture has expanded quite a lot. So agriculture covers more than 1/3 of the global land surface, and it comes with many different threats and challenges. That's not new. However, most of the public attention and also research has one-sidedly focused on deforestation, which is an important topic. More than 90% of the deforestation is caused by agriculture expansion, but that's only one side of the story. And we have heard that grassland and savanna ecosystems are important ecosystems and are often neglected. So we find biodiversity hotspots and we find ecosystems which give multiple ecosystem services to people. Here I listed some of the threats we know also from literature that are ongoing and accelerating in non-forest ecosystems. We have an accelerated vegetation loss, we have degradation, often caused from land use, but also invasive species and climate change plays a role here. And we have some leakage effects from forest conservation. So the research questions that guiding now my talk are 3 rather simple questions, but some are complicated to answer. So first, what's the extent of global agriculture expansion into non-forest ecosystems? Second, can we identify some patterns, some spatiotemporal dynamics? And the third, and maybe the most complicated, is what are the underlying drivers behind it? So a little bit coming closer to that question, how those processes actually work. First, on the methods. So methods are divided in 2 steps. So the first step is reconstructing global land use change. So we developed a rather new global data set, global geospatial data set on 60 years of land use and land cover maps on a 1 kilometer resolution. The first version is published in 2021, but now there's a new recent version upcoming early next year, hopefully. And I guide you a little bit on the specialities, how this data set was produced. So it brings together the 2 worlds of Earth observation-based geospatial data information from remote sensing side with long-term statistics from the FAO. So I will give an example. So it's a retrospective process. So we start from a base map in the year 2020, which is now based on world cover, 10-meter resolution world cover data set. And we have the net changes between each land use type from the FAO given for each country globally. And those net changes for each land use type are calculated or are multiplied with a growth change factor. And the growth change factor is derived from long-time remote sensing time series. And for this we use ESA CCI land cover because it's the longest continuous time series we have for the period. So we translate the net changes into matrix of land use transitions. And we do that for each country. And now we have like a range of multiple remote sensing-based products, land cover classifications. I think we use in total more than 30 products, and not only global, but also regional products like Korean land cover. But yeah, Moody's, Landsat-based information like the Hansen Forest Change dataset. And these are all like put on the reference year harmonized, which means that the mean fraction, the mean like agreement, occurrence of different land use types are guiding the spatial allocation of those growth changes on the grid. So the outcome is this dataset Hilda Plus. We have 6 major land use types. And now I want a special word to the differentiation between grassland, managed grassland and unmanaged grassland, which is a bit tricky, maybe also limitations still in the dataset, because for this we used an additional dataset, the global GLW, Gridded Livestock of the World product, from which is only in one point in time, so the year 2010. And we combined that with FIO livestock numbers to get the patterns back in time. And this has, of course, some flaws, but with this we have just a distinction between grassland, natural grasslands, and managed grasslands or grazed lands. So one can imagine that our pasture category is quite widespread. So we have heavily managed grasslands there. We have also some very extensively grazed nomadic pastoral systems in there. So this is something you have to be cautious about. Then the second step is analyzing, so from those data sets, or from the Hilda Plus dataset, we derive land use transitions, and we also identify agriculture expansion into non-forest ecosystems. And so the next step then, which is about finding out what is driving those processes, is applying multivariate statistics. And the first step for this was finding a set of driving indicators. Of course, the selection of these driving indicators was a bit based on data availability at the global scale. So we used here country scale data only, because we tried to address also indirect drivers such as economy, demography and politics, and also some more production related factors and environmental factors. And we tried, so these are all time series information, country scale data for those 60 years. And we try to correlate this time series with the rates of land use change for the different land use transition. I will show it later. So for this we used the PCMCI metric, which is a causal network estimation. And it applies the partial correlation index as a measure of significant links. And yeah, with this we try to address a little bit what factors have similar time trajectories than those agriculture expansion and land use changes. So coming to the results on the first question. So what's the extent of agriculture expansion into non-forest ecosystem? First, this is the map of all those different land transitions that we mapped from the Hilda Plus product. Some of those transitions are single step or binary transitions. They have only one, so it's a pixel-based analysis. They have only one land use change in the 60 years. For example, forest being converted to croplands, which is more those red colors in the Amazon, for example. But there's also some more multiple change transitions, for example, cropland abandonment processes, which sometimes the cropland is abandoned going to shrubby, grassy landscapes and eventually even to forest. So yeah, but we will focus only on agriculture expansion into non-forest ecosystems here. And I highlight some regions, maybe it's not so good to see, where these are found. So we see these paler reddish and paler yellowish colors for pasture rangeland expansion and cropland expansion into non-forest ecosystems. And what is sticking out here is the Pampa and the Cerrado regions in Brazil, but also Western Africa and Eastern African region, where savannas have been converted into agriculture in this time. But also we have vast pasture or grazeland expansion in China. Yeah, but this is mostly which I also said, very extensive grazing, so it's not so it's all included in this land use transitions. And we see also in Thailand kind of a lot of savannas that have been converted to mostly rice or cropland expansion. So overall, we see combined 5.5 million square kilometers that have been converted from non-forest ecosystems to agriculture. And compared to deforestation for agriculture, we find that this is more than twice as much than global deforestation. So it's in extent, it plays a huge role globally. Coming to the second question about spatial temporal dynamics. So this is a bit complicated. We will also focus only on agriculture expansion, but we can see on the x-axis the years, and on the y-axis the rate of land use change in area for all those different land use transitions. Coming only to crop and pasture expansion into non-forest ecosystems, we can identify phases where it was a rather stable expansion and accelerating phases. So globally we see, when we look at the more yellowish line, that cropland expansion was accelerating until around about 2010, and then there's a slight deceleration. We can also, if we look at different world regions, we can identify shifts in time and also in space. For example, here the axes are not, it's too small to see, but they are not the same. So we see huge shift from cropland and pasture expansion in South America in the early times, more to African continent, and we see large-scale acceleration processes in around 2000 in Africa. So now the last question about what is underlying those changes and what are the drivers. And this is still a bit exploratory and still under development, because this is now the results from this PCMCI analysis of combining or correlating the time series of those driver indicators from different groups with the land use change, and only for cropland expansion into non-forest ecosystems and also pasture expansion in non-forest ecosystems. And what we see here, these are the driver groups which are ranked by their partial correlation, and not surprisingly, economic factors show the highest partial correlation, so from group-wise, but also production factors and demographic factors are similar in importance here for cropland expansion. In pasture rangeland expansion, we see also politics being important, but I have to check, or we have to check, if this is maybe also a bias from large scale. In China there was this large expansion, and it's still not, so it's still under development. There are some limitations, of course, here. The analysis was done with a moving time lag. But still, of course, correlation is not always causality. We have to be careful about spurious correlations here. The grouping has an enormous effect. So, and also some of the effects might not be country scale, but rather regional scale. And the next step would be also to look at more into the environmental factors and do a more region-based analysis, because we have those spatialized data. And yeah. So on the top plots, you can see also some of those individual indicators which show these larger correlations for those land use transitions. So summarizing, we found that agriculture expansion into non-forest ecosystem are twice as large, or more than twice as large, as global deforestation for agriculture. We see phases of acceleration globally, and also for different world regions, we see shifts, and we can also analyze more of those different land use transitions together. And the driver analysis requires a little bit more research, also try out different methods, but we see from our preliminary results that economy and politics are amongst important driver groups. And so overall, I think there's a need to include non-forest areas into public attention and also into policy. But I think it's also a very, very difficult task because food security and justice have to play a role here. And this is just a recent statement from the president of the African World Bank saying that the African savanna has to be developed for agriculture, or more agriculture expansion has to be promoted there to provide food security for those regions and to avoid the dependency of imports for food. So yeah, with this, I think it's a very tricky task, always like with these topics. But yeah, the extent and the dynamics of those expansions into non-forest ecosystems are super large. And with this, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And also, we are always open for the Hilda Plus development to find new data set, incorporate new data set. It's an ongoing process. And I can't wait to see the output of the global pasture watch data to make the delineation between managed grasslands and unmanaged grasslands better. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Okay, so I'll take these 2 over here. And just to note, we're going to be back in this room after lunch for another session on non-forest ecosystems, this time on regional work in the Chaco, the US, and also regional definitions.
Hi, great. Thanks a lot for this talk. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciated you making the nuanced distinction between planted pastures and rangelands. But I had a question about the final results, though, because they show a lot of areas of expansion of rangelands. But these areas have been historically managed by pastoralists. And it's showing an expansion of rangelands. And so I didn't understand. So they aren't planted pasture areas, but you're showing an expansion of rangelands into areas that were already rangelands. So I was just trying to reconcile that. Could you please nuance that a little bit?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think it's an important point because I think it's still a problem that our pasture and rangeland classes group together. And that's also a next step we want to tackle in the upcoming data, to have a more nuanced different classes for that, because it's just not the same impact of having those extensively grazed areas expanding into non-forest ecosystems compared to high intensity. So the next steps would be also have intensity information on those land use categories. So I think it's still all in one. So that's why also it's maybe this large extent is a bit biased by such systems, as you said.
It's extremely important for the justice implications on your last slide, I think. You know, if these areas are being identified as encroaching, when they're actually already supporting a lot of local indigenous people's livelihoods in these areas. So,
yeah.
Sorry, does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
So I think yes, you can't say that this encroachment is a huge negative impact or so. So we have to be careful at the end what we count as encroachment and not. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. We have time for 1 last question. I saw some hands up. They've now gone down. Is everyone ready for lunch? Should we call it there? Okay, well, that would just 1 round of applause for all of our presenters, and thank you all for coming.